So I want to kind of give you a sense of the remainder of the quarter. We're really moving along pretty fast. Time really flies. And we actually only have 4 full weeks of class left. So we're really moving pretty quickly. So this week, our focus is on media communications. We'll talk a little bit about this today and Wednesday and Friday as well. You might notice that this is chapter 12 of Wrench, so we've jumped ahead of it. I thought this chapter would be useful for you as you're thinking about your media analysis essay because it's looking at how mediated communication, like TV shows, movies, and so on, has an impact on us. So I wanted to put that earlier. Next week, we'll be looking at relationships. This is another chapter that could be really helpful for you in your essay. If you'd like to incorporate anything into that, so we'll look at that next week. Your essay is due not this Friday, but a week later by 11:59 p.m. Please submit it through Canvas. The assignment is available for you there. You can do it as a doc, docx, or PDF. Please don't do like a Pages file. You can send me like a Google Doc as a rough draft, but the easiest way to submit it for this assignment is to download like a Google Doc as a docx, and then you can just upload that to Canvas. Then we have the holiday Thanksgiving break after these next 2 weeks. When we get back from that, we'll have 2 more full weeks left in class. We'll have a week on family and communication, so looking at how members of different families communicate with each other. We'll also be talking about kind of the workplace and other areas to apply and use interpersonal communication. We have a final recording and reflection essay. This date, this Wednesday date is actually incorrect. Let me double check, because that's for my other class. Let me double check the final exam day that we have scheduled for this course. I'm also going to pull this up to help to show you where to access some of the material that will help you in completing this essay. Okay. So the final exam period we have is Wednesday, December 15th from 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. So if this is your first year here at EOU, the way that the final exam period goes, right, is that rather than have your regular meeting times, you essentially have a week where, depending on the time your class is scheduled, you're given a day for 2 hours to meet for the final time of the class. So from 10 a.m. until noon on Wednesday the 15th, we'll be using that final class time as a way to share your progress on these last essays. And then by midnight on the 16th, you'll turn that essay in. So basically, your final essay, you'll be able to talk with us about it. We'll be able to brainstorm and work together on that, and then you'll turn that in by midnight on the 16th. So let me just correct that here for you. Great. So yeah, we'll have Wednesday on the 15th to share your essays. You'll turn that in by that midnight date. And then the 2 major essays, right, that are due at this point in the class are both the interpersonal analysis essay on the 19th of November, and then the recording reflection essay on December 16th. So these are 2 different assignments that have 2 different kind of guidelines and prompts. Remember, this interpersonal analysis essay is about a relationship between 2 characters, where you're applying and using stuff in the class. This final essay that we'll be talking more about after next week is one where I'm asking you to have a conversation with somebody. Maybe it's a friend, a family member, a coworker, and so on. You'll record that conversation with their consent, and then afterwards you'll transcribe and reflect on that conversation. What has it taught you about interpersonal communication, and so on. So it's really fun and kind of interesting, and admittedly a little bit weird, right, to hear yourself speaking and to record that dialogue, but I think it's a really good way for us to apply and think about the last things in the class. So this slide is also going to be available on Canvas for you after class to get you a sense of the remaining days too. So what I want to do is give you some additional advice about this essay as you're thinking about and preparing to do that, right? So one big thing that I have available for you on Canvas is a rubric and an example outline. I know that we've gone over that a little bit in class already, but just to remind you of where to go for that one. So on the front page of Canvas, if you go to the rubrics, there's the interpersonal analysis essay rubric. So your essay is a total of 200 points, same amount as the midterm exam. The essay includes these kind of two major parts, both the substance of the essay and the structure. So remember, this is 4 to 5 pages in length, double-spaced, Times New Roman, standard font margins. You'll do kind of an introduction in the first paragraph or so, right? The introduction should describe the episode or the movie, provide us with context. My advice is, and one of the things that I've noticed that I recommend avoiding, is an essay that reads too much like a synopsis or a review of the show or the film, right? So, for instance, you're doing your essay on Stranger Things, and you're focusing on the relationship between Eleven and Jim Hopper, right? Stranger Things has a ton of different characters and a ton of different plot things going on. So if you spend a ton of time talking about the show and all these different things that aren't relevant, like all these other characters, that's wasting a lot of time in the essay. So focus it to that relationship. Tell us the things you need to know in order to understand the relationship between these two characters. If you're like talking about Vampire Diaries, oh, well, there's this character who is dead, then they got revived, now they're dead again, now they're a vampire, now they're a human again. Like, there's probably a lot that happens season to season, but try to focus it to the things that you need to know. So you can pick 2 or 3 major concepts. Heard some people who are using examples like theories, like social penetration theory and so on. Yeah?
So when it comes to the things we need to know about characters, does that include, in general, like the entire series, or just that episode that we're trying to focus on?
Sure. I might just use a sentence or so that talks about the series. Focus mainly on those characters, though.
Okay.
Think about it this way. If it's somebody that's seen TV but hasn't seen your show, what do they need to know in order to understand the dialogue that you're analyzing?
Okay.
Right? So, in this show, it's a relationship between a teacher and a student who's trying to get into this college, right? So their relationship is like this mentoring, coaching type thing, right? That'd be an example. Yeah. So as far as the body points go, right? Using those concepts in the class that you're applying and incorporating, using rich supporting details and examples. So for this essay, you should be directly quoting from the show or the movie. So easiest way to do that is to transcribe some of that dialogue back. You can also turn on like subtitles or closed captioning. It's an easy way to do that. Apply the course material to that. So the thing that I'm really looking for is, can you link these two things together, right? So you're talking about, in this episode of The Office, right, there's this relationship happening. Using the concept of social penetration theory, we understand over time that they're self-disclosing and becoming more comfortable, which helps to explain what's happening in the show. And then use a conclusion to summarize your key ideas. So one way that you can think about structuring this that I really like for just a general essay format, and again, depending on your instructor, could look a little bit different. Tell me what you're going to tell me. Tell me what you told me. Use the intro to tell me what you're going to tell me, right? Use the intro to establish your main points and ideas that you'll be covering in the essay. Tell me, in the essay itself, you'll be making those points. Social penetration theory helps us to understand the relationship between these two characters. Tell me what you told me. In the conclusion, say, in this essay, I explore the relationship between these two characters, right? So those are the things that I'm looking for in terms of its structure and so on. As far as style goes, right, I definitely recommend the like 24 or 48-hour method. Again, my partner runs a nonprofit and has to manage kind of grant applications. So what she does is she prints it out like a day or two in advance, doesn't look or think about it, comes back to the essay and looks at it with a clean pair of eyes, suddenly notices a ton of spelling errors. So that's an easy way to work on that. You can use MLA, APA, or Chicago. Pick the one that you're most comfortable with. Make sure to use both full in-text citations and a works cited list. Yeah, Steve.
So are there any spacing and font requirements, font size?
So just use like a 12-point, double-spaced. So like a standard font, like a Times New Roman, is a good idea there. Yeah, so if you're in that kind of range and size, you're good. Yeah.
Okay, so I have two questions.
Uh-huh.
So one, are you wanting us to like describe the characters individually? Like, would that help the reader understand?
If it's a brief description that helps us understand the dialogue, then yes.
Okay, and then for the NLA, APA, whatever,
Uh-huh.
we like use the director? I don't really know how
Yeah.
you would cite a movie.
Yeah, so that's a good question. And I'm actually about to help with that because the Purdue OWL has kind of a way of listing out the citation style regardless of the format that you use.
Okay.
Yeah, so one thing, since I'm seeing a couple questions about like how much do I describe or talk about the characters, my advice is that the like exposition and explanation about who the characters or who the show is fine if it's confined to like your first paragraph or so. If you're going much past the first paragraph, like if you're going into your second page and you're still describing the show, then there's probably too much, right? Cut it down to the key ideas that we need to understand as an outsider who's looking at these things. So I have a link on the front page of Canvas for the Purdue OWL. But one thing that the Purdue OWL has that's I think a really useful thing is ways to go about citing for a movie. So film, movie, right? There's this example here where you list the title, director, studio, and release year, right? There's also kind of models about how to do that in text. So that would be doing it in MLA style, right? So Lucas George, director, Star Wars Episode 4, A New Hope, aka the second best Star Wars film in the series, by me. Publisher and year, right? So that's an example of doing that there. Purdue OWL will also show you the style guides for doing it in APA or Chicago as well. So you've got this whole collapsible drop down for how you can use formatting for these other two styles. If you're ever wondering like how to cite in a particular style and need some additional support, please let me know, and I'm happy to look over your citations or to provide additional support. You can also use something like a citation machine or citation maker, but I definitely recommend like looking through it and double checking that it has the information listed correctly. So the things that you should be citing from, right? You should be citing from two sources in this essay. You generally don't need any more unless you really want to. One, you should be citing from Wrench, the textbook for the class. And two, you should be citing from the TV show or movie using the citations that make the most sense for your citation style. Make sure that you're including both in-text citations, right? So that's either a parenthetical citation, like Wrench 2019, as well as the works cited list, right? Where you're listing out the full citations of those sources. Yes, Natalie.
So if you maybe do like a movie,
Uh-huh.
so how would we, so like let's say that there's like a certain line that we want to put in our essay,
Uh-huh.
how would we like do the citation at the end? Would we cite the director and then director, because there you can't do like a
Sure.
title or anything like that.
So when you have like the show itself, right, you do the parenthetical citation, and depending on the format, it generally looks like last name of the director and year. So that's a common model in like APA or MLA. If you're doing Chicago, that would be like a footnote or endnote. So it'd be like a 1 2, 3, like that you'd have afterwards, and then that'd be referenced at the end of the page, at the end of the document. Yeah, so use that like in text whenever you're quoting or citing from either the book or from the show or movie, and then include that full citation at the end. What was that? Yeah. I'll try to help with some additional examples too on how to do that citation, just to help you out there. Please, 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 if you're procrastinating and running out of time, don't let citations be the thing you procrastinate on, right? Because plagiarism is not necessarily intentional, right? It's if you're not attributing a source either in text or through works cited. Remember, that's at best 0 in the assignment, at worst is 0 in the class. I hate to do that. Please be careful. I'd much rather have a late essay than an essay that doesn't cite sources, right? It's also much better for your grade. So please make sure to do that. Also, and again, this shouldn't be an issue, please make sure that it's your own work. For this class, please don't use an essay that you're using for or have used for another class without checking in with me first. And please make sure that you're not like quoting or using material from outside sources without using that properly. I do go through like the Turnitin plagiarism checker just to make sure. So again, that's generally not an issue, but I want to make sure that we're on the same page there. So that's available for you as a resource. I recommend looking through that rubric as you're completing the essay. And then the other thing I have is an example outline that helps you to know and visualize what to expect. So you have the introduction, where you talk about the show or movie, information, and a preview. Your body paragraphs, so you can have 2 or 3 major parts. You can also break this up into smaller paragraphs if you want to, where you were talking about an example from the show or movie and linking it to the concept and interpersonal communication that you're bringing in. So again, if you're really interested in cultural intelligence and you're looking at the Netflix show Emily in Paris, well, it's probably not a lot of cultural intelligence you're going to find there. If you see that show, it's not a very good example of a character understanding or engaging with the culture, but right, you're applying that example to show and put those two things together. And then in the conclusion, again, restate your points, review those main points, and I recommend kind of ending your essay with a so what? Why does it matter? What have we learned, right? By watching this show, we've recognized that nonverbal cues play a huge role in how we choose to communicate, and that the meaning that we as viewers of TV get from characters and their relationships is informed by nonverbal communication. So that could be a way that you could sum up your key ideas. Again, think about this essay as a way of explaining, right? As I've mentioned before, communication classes kind of ruin TV shows and movies because you're like always have a part of you that starts to analyze them, right? So explain to me what's going on using the things that you've learned in this class. So that's kind of what I'm looking for there as an example outline. You can draw directly from that if you want to with your assignment. You could just like paste it into Google Doc and use that to start filling in. A few other tips, right? Again, pick a single episode from a TV show. Don't do the whole show, especially if it's a long show. Just pick an episode that you feel like it's either a random one or exemplifies the things that you're looking for. Again, directly quote. That will help a lot. Avoid that over description. A brief introduction is enough. Keep it generally to the first paragraph or so. For your body points, you can pick 2 or 3 major units or sections. Communication and relationships and communication and family. Some of the things we'll be getting into later in the quarter. A good essay, again, explains, and I'm happy to look at your rough drafts, your outlines, your ideas, anything that you'd like to send me along the way. If you're struggling and you're behind, the sooner you reach out to me, the sooner that I can support you and help you to complete that assignment. Any other questions about this essay? I would imagine you might have some questions as we get closer to it, but feel free to reach out when they come up. Again, I'm really excited to see what you have to share. As far as the rest of this class goes, I know I spent a lot of time talking about that essay, but when we are looking at the remaining classes and the way that you might be taking notes and following along, we don't have a big cumulative final exam or anything like that, right? Instead, your sort of interpersonal analysis essay, as well as your final recording and reflection essay, are the two big ones where you're applying and using some of the things in the remainder of the class. Some of our last few weeks look at like communication in family, communication in the workplace, and so on, so that you have examples to help you make sense of your transcribed conversation. So if it's with a family member, a coworker, and so on. So my advice is that rather than trying to get like every term or idea memorized or written down verbatim, use some of these remaining classes to make sense of the key ideas and concepts that you'd like to use in these essays. So that can be a way for you to apply and think about the remainder of the class. So I want to talk a little bit more about mediated communication, and we'll continue that discussion on Wednesday and Friday. But some of the new stuff that we're getting into for this week gets at the role of media in shaping how we think about and engage in communication with each other, right? So one thing that I think is a common error, and I make this all the time myself, is people saying the media. You know, the media said this, the media said that. So media is plural, right? So media persuades us, or by using media, we can X, Y, Z, right? Media refers to multiple pieces of things such as Facebook, all forms of social media, texting, and so on, right? One way to think about and help us to define and make sense of media is sort of like mediation. So if you're in a conflict or a disagreement with other people, the conflict is oftentimes mediated. There's like a third person who's helping to manage and deal with the conflict. In the same way, our communication is mediated if there is a device, like a phone, that is helping us to manage and create the possibilities for that relationship, right? So there's a joke in 2020 that's probably still ongoing in a lot of settings that's like Zoom University, right, where we've used Zoom so much for communication with each other, like it's a form of mediated communication, right? So this fellow here, what looks like a Twilight Zone episode, is Marshall McLuhan. So going all the way back for the 1950s, he was considered one of the most kind of foundational people in communication and media studies. And his most famous quotation was the single sentence, "The media is the message," right? This came, of course, at a time well before things like the internet, but came at a time where TV was a really big deal, was really shaping how we communicated with each other. So McLuhan's argument was that the method by which we communicate, a TV show, using the radio, and so on, has such a big way of shaping how we understand each other that it essentially controls or dictates the message itself. One really classic example, is anybody familiar with the Richard Nixon, John F. Kennedy debate and all of that stuff? A couple people. So the Nixon-JFK debate was basically the first televised presidential debate, right? So JFK ended up winning that race, was assassinated not too long after. But one thing that was especially interesting was that the debate was both played on the radio and played on TV. People who listened to that debate on the radio said, oh yeah, Richard Nixon won the debate. He had better arguments, he had better supporting points, and so on. People who watched the debate on TV said, JFK won the debate. Why? Because JFK appeared younger, he appeared more charismatic. Richard Nixon was kind of older, right? He was like sweating all the time, seemed kind of flustered in his nonverbal style and mannerisms, right? If you've ever seen the show Futurama, you know that Richard Nixon is kind of silly and comical in how he presented himself. Yeah.
Wasn't Nixon also sick during that time?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that was part of that too. Yeah, that he was kind of under the weather. But not only an example, that's a really good point, right? Not only an example of how important nonverbal communication is, but also an example of how the medium, the method by which that information was delivered, substantially changed the way that we thought about it, right? If we think about this in a more like contemporary context, TikTok has substantially changed the way that we send and deliver messages. I visited my sister last weekend. She's a middle school teacher, and she was talking about how like a bunch of the middle schoolers will basically destroy and like ransack the bathrooms and then like upload TikToks of doing that. They're like, oh hey, you know, if I completely ruin the bathroom and put toilet paper everywhere, then I'll go viral. And in many ways, right, it's like our interpersonal behavior is being shaped by our desire for media, attention, influence, and so on. Another example is Twitter, right? So while there are people that will do like multi-part tweets, Twitter has like pretty substantial character limits. So we end up seeing a lot of shorter posts. We end up seeing a lot of people who will tweet like a hot take or a controversial opinion that they try to confine into that character limit. But the way that we communicate, the types of messages that we choose and so on, look really different thanks to the way that the media does or does, see I did it again, the way that media does or does not facilitate our communication. So I think there's a lot of critique of McLuhan, right? The media is not necessarily the full message. There's a lot more to what we choose to convey and share that exists outside of that. But I like to think about media kind of being like a thing that helps to sculpt and change how we choose to share material, right? You can mold and move like Play-Doh into a shape, but it's still like the same color or pattern that you've chosen to create, right? You're modifying it and changing it, but it's still your message. And so it's not necessarily that the media is fully the message, but that the media shapes or alters our message. So, right, mediated communication is said to do 4 different things. That is, it enables, facilitates, invites, and encourages. So one of the areas that I focus on a lot in terms of my own research and work is disability rhetoric. One of the things that I've really tried to focus on is how folks with disabilities use things like online and social media and so on to advocate for a lot of issues, especially knowing that many of the face-to-face ways to advocate on issues are not necessarily accessible, right? So, for instance, if somebody's having really severe migraine, or if somebody wants to go march at a protest, but the streets are not wheelchair accessible, online forms of participation, protest, and activism are ways for people to still be involved, right? So it enables and actually allows people to engage. If we were living in a world with COVID, but without like things like Zoom or video calls or conferencing or anything like that, our college experience would look really different. It facilitates or creates a way for people to engage. So if you've ever had a class where on Canvas, you're asked to participate in a discussion with other students, right? It facilitates that discussion. It invites, so if you ever have like push notifications from social media, I like keep getting emails from Twitter that are like, hey, we miss you, you should post on Twitter. And I don't like really use Twitter, I don't really understand it very well. So I don't bother doing that. We are invited, we're given the opportunity to use media to communicate, and mediated communication encourages us to participate, to get involved, and so on. Again, I'm not one of those folks that thinks that like social media and internet and all that is bad. It keeps us from communicating. I think it just changes and it makes our dynamic of communicating with each other different. It's created new opportunities, some new challenges, and changes in how we get to know each other. So if you have ever played a game that involves like an avatar or character, for instance, here is Second Life, right, where you have this like character that you create. If you were like me when COVID started, and you just played Animal Crossing a bunch, right, you created like a character and a house and a setting for that. You know, if you play games like World of Warcraft, Neopets, other games that involve you like creating your own characters, right? It's a big idea that relates to identity. Media is a big aspect of impression management. In fact, you know, a lot of employers will look at things like your social media activity. They'll search for you online, and people have lost jobs because, you know, they have like a public photo of them like drinking with their friends, or looking at people online and doing those kinds of searches can be a positive effect. If you have a good social media profile and presence, to an outsider at least, then you can come across more positively and be more likely to be hired. Mediated communication also plays a pretty big role in communication apprehension, right? So one thing that's brought up is that a lot of times people maybe feel more comfortable with sharing themselves online than they do face-to-face. For instance, a lot of support groups and networks for folks in the like LGBTQ+ community might choose to engage and out themselves online because it's a lot easier to do so and form connections with people who are kind of similar to where they might be feeling in terms of challenges, identity, and so on. So media definitely plays a big role in allowing people to feel more comfortable in sharing who they are. So, you know, there's a lot of different elements that mediated communication has impacted our relationships. There's a lot of other classes that get into some of these issues too. For instance, some faculty in our department, like Dr. Anderson, look into things like participatory culture and identity. She actually has people participate in like an online, I think kind of like a Second Life or something similar to that. Dr. Chen looks at things like media ethics and so on. There's a lot of interesting areas where that stuff can be explored further. I think for this class, the big focus is understanding how the use of mediated communication facilitates or like interpersonal, two-way, two-person communication overall. So these are some kind of interesting points that we'll continue to explore as we go forward in the class. Should mention too that I believe your window for winter registration should be open. So definitely get in touch with your advisor on that if you haven't done so already. I'm teaching 2 sections of small group communication and then 2 sections of a course called Are You Listening? One is going to be online. So, you know, just start to think about what you're interested in taking for the winter if you haven't done so already. To wrap up for today, use that slide and as well as the schedule on Canvas to start to map out, star and circle those major due dates. Remember, on the 19th, you have your essay coming up. And we started to talk about mediated communication. On Wednesday, please read these pages of Wrench. We'll be talking a bit more about media and identity. We'll also be doing a full debrief of the midterm exam. Go ahead and pass forward your attendance activity for today in brainstorming.